Hi, everybody. So, what I want to speak about today is this idea of the path of sanctification. And behind me are some deer. You can see them charging along over there. Um, there's a whole bunch of them. I wanted to speak about the path of sanctification that is available to us in the post-Vatican II era. You see, in the traditional ways of speaking about our spiritual lives, we speak about the vocation to the religious state. And the vocation to the religious state involves pursuing divine charity, which is that's what the whole spiritual life is about, having charity in our hearts. And we do that, by fulfilling the commands. And so we fulfill the commands of God, and that helps us live with charity in our hearts. And essentially the thing is that to better follow the commands, Jesus gives us the counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And these things are there to help us live out the life of charity. But it's very interesting. In previous videos, I've been reflecting on the nature of the types of the reasons why it has been that case, that the religious state has been seen as that safer way throughout the history of the church. And looking at the way that this kind of plays out throughout history is something that is, and there's different things that have kind of clicked, and I think this is a new way of talking about this. And essentially, the great danger in our spiritual lives is the problem of attachment. And when we have attachments lead there to be a kind of way in which the issues that we have inside, the unconscious dynamics, become conscious. They end up becoming something that gets in the way of our functioning. There's something that gets in the way of how our minds work in a healthy manner. So if things are going to be triggering, it's better to avoid triggering things. And so essentially the recommendation for living a life of charity has been to avoid things that will lead to the triggering of unconscious dynamics such as anger and fear and so on and so forth. So I spoke about in a previous video about how the trajectory of the church over time is the redemption of various types of ideologies and practices. And many of the videos I make are about the redeeming of different therapies, different coping skills, and integrating them fully into the synthesis of techniques that can be used to manage our emotions in a Catholic context. And because of this, I believe that in this time period, there is a kind of opening of a door toward a path of arranging our faith and its content that does not contradict anything that comes before it, yet proposes a new way forward, integrating all the principles into a coherent whole that has a kind of inverse direction. It's almost as if we think about the validity of the Novus Ordo Mass, the Mass you find at most parishes, which is versus populum, facing the people, is valid, and it's a real Mass just as well as the Ad Orientem Latin Mass is valid. That there's a way of organizing the principles of our faith that faces one direction and a way that organizes the principles facing another direction. And I'm talking about this in a different kind of way, obviously, in this video. I'm talking about bringing together a synthesis of the principles of spirituality that propose a path of sanctification in the world, which has a kind of order to it, that you will see momentarily has a kind of inverse order to it that is different from the way we have conceived of the spiritual life in the past. And let me turn this thing around. There's a beautiful tree over there. It's a beautiful scene. See that nice scene? I thought that was a beautiful scene there. But the thing is, there's this way of talking about this in a different way. And so I really want to share this with you, that I believe that when we look at the original councils, they are primarily geared toward salvation, and they are poverty, chastity, and obedience. And when we look at a kind of new path that I believe is opening up in sanctification, the sanctification of the laity in the post-Vatican II era, it's not only about salvation. Salvation is part of it, but it pursues salvation in a way that actually has two goals as the central goals, which are physical and mental healing are also added to that spiritual element. So there's not only that core goal, it's kind of seeking salvation through an emphasis on psychological and physical healing. These are important parts of this vocation. And instead of the councils, there are different paths. And these paths are kind of parallel to yet different from the evangelical councils. They are a different style of holiness, and not necessarily a style of unholiness. So what we are seeing, I believe, is a shift from where there are some people who, rather than pursuing obedience, pursue unique purposes in the world. So it doesn't mean that they do this independent of obedience to the church, its commands, its structures, but that their primary orientation is not toward a kind of conformity, but a kind of uniqueness, a kind of fulfilling exterior missions that are unique. And it's interesting to see how this is a direct play, so to speak, of inversion without contradiction of the idea of obedience as one of the evangelical counsels. In the same way, poverty can be conceived of as the means by which a person renounces the world and pursues salvation. In the context of the laity and its sanctification in post-Vatican II, I believe that prosperity is a key towards sanctification. You can actually see this. I'm not saying that it's not preaching a prosperity gospel here. I'm saying that the challenges involved in commerce and necessary detachments and service and purification of motives that could occur in a sanctified commerce can become a path toward holiness. This already is being done many times in movements such, and I'm not saying that I endorse the spiritual goals of these movements, but for example, in contemporary spirituality, alternative spirituality, and New Age spirituality, there is a lot of emphasis on how to purify the motives for business and commerce. And there's a sanctification, so to speak. Of course, it's not a real sanctification because it's in a false context, and it also proposes dangers and kind of blind spots. But these blind spots, I believe, can be healed by bringing them into a Catholic context, so that the pathway of business, the pathway of heart-centered business, as they call it sometimes, as like having a servant-type business, can become a pathway towards sanctification, which is no less valid than the pathway of poverty. And that this can be a real path that's very interesting, because the danger here is that this path stirs up much more attachments than poverty. And that's why historically it's never been pursued. But again, the difference that I'm proposing in these videos is always that because we are in an era where we are able to redeem the full spectrum of skills from the other religions into a Catholic context, we are now able to work with this rapid purifying force of attachment, which draws out all the unconscious material of the passions into a rapid purification that can be done. And if you can get people, like in marriages, for example, who support each other in kind of working through this process, who understand that this is the purpose of their lives, then you can maybe have social support and all these techniques and all these things to actually very rapidly purify the mind in a way that is different from, distinct from, yet not contradictory to all the wisdom of our spiritual traditions. It's merely a rearrangement of the direction that everything is moving in without actually contradicting any principles. And so the interesting thing we want to say next, so we've gone through that purpose is the kind of new version of obedience, that prosperity is the new version of poverty, and that relationship becomes the domain in which we do the work that chastity once did. Because we kind of have the necessity of purification in relationships that becomes a path toward achieving self-knowledge, achieving patience, achieving the virtues. It becomes this conscious path, as many things in contemporary spirituality state, that there's these ways of using relationships as a means to become conscious. There's these phrases like conscious parenting, or these type of things, which of course are in a New Age context, but need to be baptized, need to be fully reformed and brought into a Catholic context. Because what's, I believe, possible is that the Catholicism leads us to a complete sanctification. It's the only pathway that leads us to the complete sanctification of every aspect of the human person, that fully affirms the dignity of the human person in a way that says everything can be sanctified, everything can be united to God. Every other tradition kind of holds back and says, okay, like the Orthodox man, I like the imagination, or so. And I'm not saying there's not beautiful things in these traditions, but like there's these things where Catholicism asks us to be able to convert everything to Christ. And so I think that one of the most beautiful things we can learn here is that when we can see why was it that things were the way they were, we can kind of understand the principles. It's not just like, okay, it has to be that way. Being a monk is better than being a married person, or being a monk is better than being a lay person. The question is, how do we live fully the principles of our faith, given the way that life is played out, given the way God has provided for us, given the plan that we're a part of? And when we get stuck in like an idea that God, these principles can only be fulfilled in the plan looks a certain way, then we don't live our life to the full, and maybe we aren't living out the principles that we could be living and living the holiness that we could be living, or the holiness that God wants for us. So I'm trying to lay out here is the possibility that God is laying out for people in the modern age a new path of holiness, a path of holiness which is the sanctification of all things, which rather than only being focused on eternal salvation, focuses on psychological and physical healing. And it doesn't mean it ignores eternal salvation. That rather than being about obedience is about unique purpose. That rather than about being about poverty is about conscious or heart-centered business and prosperity. That rather than being about the idea of chastity is about relationship, a healthy relationship. And so I think there's a beautiful way of conceiving of the spiritual life in the post-Vatican II era, which coherently reorganizes the whole of the Catholic tradition and its spiritual principles, moving in a different direction. And so I think that this can be a beautiful way of understanding the possibility of what our life can look like in the world as a pathway of holiness.